Sure, I can go ahead and get started. Hello, everybody. Yeah, can everybody hear me okay? Ralph, can you hear me? I can see your face. Okay. My name is Don Martin. I'm a principal with DuPont Sustainable Solutions. By way of background, I have been in the safety, health, environmental, and risk management profession for over 40 years. So right out of college, I went right into this career field and have spent my time working in a couple of big industry sectors, most notably petrochemical refining and pulp and paper manufacturing. And I spent about 25 years in those two careers. And then I moved into consulting, and I've been doing consulting work for about 15 years. So over that 40 plus year time span, I've been exposed to a wide range of safety, health, and environmental metrics, key performance indicators, that type of thing, and have formed some opinions about their value. In the last 8 or 9 years, I've been spending a lot of time on the subject of fatality prevention, understanding how those fatalities occur, what we could be doing to prevent them, and also, are there any indicators out there, any metrics that would give us some advance warning, if you will, that a fatal event is on the horizon. And so hopefully during today's conversation, we'll be able to share some of those experiences with you. And with that, by the way, I live here in Florida, so all the talk about snow and sun, I can relate to both. I used to live up in Maine, and that's where Jonathan and I met a couple of decades ago. And I live in Florida now, and enjoying the sunshine whenever I can. And Ralph, how about over to you?
Okay, thank you. My name is Ralph Stewart. I am the Environmental Safety Manager at Keene State College in Keene, New Hampshire. I had been here for 7 years. Before that, I was at Cornell University in Ithaca for about 3 years as the chemical hygiene officer. Before that, I was at the University of Vermont for 25 or so years, doing pretty much all the EHS stuff because I started the program in 1985, and it gradually grew like Flopsy, like everybody has probably experienced here. EHS responsibilities just grow and grow and grow because nobody else wants to do it. And so over the time, as your program grows, you have to figure out how to start establishing priorities. And we do that informally, we do that formally, we do that with indicators sometimes, we do it with other forms of feedback. But I had specific experiences around indicators that I think might be helpful to share. So that's why I think Jonathan thought it might be a good idea for me to get involved in this.
Great, thank you, Ralph.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't we kick it off? I know we've got a series of questions here that we're gonna, Jonathan was gonna ask you, and I can just do that. And I appreciate any help you can give me since I'm new to leading the webinar here. But so let's start off with the title of our webinar here today. What are leading versus lagging indicators? Ralph, do you want to start us off there?
Well, my experience with indicators in general, as I said, I've tried to develop indicators for a wide variety of health and safety programs, but the most formal approach I was involved in was with the EPA from about 1997 through about 2008, when I was at the University of Vermont. We worked with EPA Region 1, specifically New England EPA, to identify whether, so Region 1 at that point, some of you know from personal experience, Region 1 was being very aggressive about RCRA enforcement in the laboratories. They were holding laboratories to industrial standards when it came to paperwork and training requirements that were just not reasonable. So 3 schools, UMass Boston, Boston College, and UVM, agreed to work with EPA to come up with a rule that we thought was workable. In return for that, we had to demonstrate that we could reduce the amount of chemical waste coming out of our laboratories. Pollution prevention became the goal rather than strict compliance throughout the institution. And in order to make that case, we had to identify indicators that would show progress in pollution prevention programs at the schools. So if you look at the handouts, which I think are being made available to you, EPA had 4 indicators they thought would make sense for us to use as measures of success. And the 3 schools, we looked at their list and we said, there's no way we can promise to reduce the amount of hazardous waste coming out of our labs, because this is 1997. NIH is funding more and more and more research all the time. All of our research activity is increasing. We're going to have more waste. We didn't know how to measure the amount of research going on in our laboratories, because dollars do not necessarily mean chemicals. So we came up with more imaginative responses to suggestions for indicators, and they had their ideas, we had our ideas, and we couldn't really agree. So we just said, okay, we'll do all of them. And that gave us 8 indicators. In order to break the tie, we came up with a 9th indicator, which is really, are we doing the other 8 indicators? So we did that for about 4 years. Every February, the schools would get together, we would write this gigantic report, 55 or 60 pages long, to explain to EPA what great things were happening on our campuses with regard to pollution prevention in laboratories. And then we weren't getting any response from EPA in terms of feedback. So we said, okay, well, if you guys don't care enough, we're not going to do all 9 indicators anymore. We're just going to pick the 4 that we think are most interesting. And so we picked the 3 that we thought were good. 3 of our original suggestions, we took one of their original suggestions. And at that point, we had switched over from the Clinton-Gore administration to the Bush administration, and the Bush bureaucracy did not have a lot invested in the Excel project. And so they said, sure, go do what you want. And so it took us 5 more years. And at the end of those 5 years, the EPA decided it was good enough for government work, and they promulgated the Subpart K rule nationally. They did, at the national level, they accepted Subpart K as part of the RCRA universe. They did not require states to accept Subpart K in their own state. New Hampshire, I do not get to work with Subpart K. Vermont, if I was working in Vermont, I would be able to work with Subpart K. So the key point here is that indicators were identified, were tracked. Some of them were leading, some of them were lagging, but overall, the project as a whole, we had to think very carefully about what we can measure in a reliable way over time. And we had aspirations that the indicators would go in particular directions, but many of them were more complex than we thought at first blush. For example, the amount of laboratory hazardous waste, and so they were not necessarily leading indicators.
Cool.
I think.
Yeah, cool. I'm back, at least with audio, at least temporarily.
Welcome back.
Well, thank you, Chris. That was cool. And, you know, it was this discussion, conversation that Ralph, thanks, Patrick, that Ralph and I had that kind of kicked this off. And I think it's a good example. And Dawn, I know that you have your own example. You've done a lot of work more in industry in different ways. And I think it's mostly significant injuries and fatalities, which also, as we all know, plague research labs in academia as well as private industry. So do you want to kind of do something similar and talk about your view from your experiences on this issue of leading versus lagging?
Sure. Well, you know, similar to the journey that Ralph was on the industry side of things, and you know, having started in this profession in the late 70s, through the 80s, man, we were always focused on lagging indicators, all outcome based. So on the safety side of things, it's recordable injury rates, lost time rates. On the environmental side of things, it's how many spills or releases or exceedances above permits did you have. And so we were always tracking these performance indicators that were all outcome based. And over time, we started to realize that that wasn't really telling the whole story, and that it was hard to continue to focus on just the outcomes and try to improve the situation that you were facing at your site. And so we started evolving to this idea that there are some upstream indicators that we'll call leading indicators that are maybe behaviorally under my control, that if I can work on those indicators, then I can maybe even prevent those other outcomes from occurring. And to Ralph's point about prevention versus compliance, is that you start thinking about, instead of controlling the outcome, how about controlling the conditions that led to that outcome? And you can create a series of indicators or metrics that give you some advanced information about whether you have that situation under control that leads to that outcome. So, for example, one of the things we've learned in our fatality prevention research is that a location's recordable injury rate is a very poor and very inaccurate predictor of whether you have fatal accident controls in place or not. So we work with organizations all the time that have recordable rates that are less than 1, and yet they still experience fatal or near fatal accidents. And so their recordable rates don't provide accurate indicators about whether they have critical controls in place to prevent fatal accidents. And so now you start developing a portfolio of other metrics that provide that information, so you can know whether your critical controls are in place and performing, and that provides you a much more reliable indicator for the prevention of fatalities. So I'll stop there, Jonathan, as just a little warm up to that topic.
Yeah, no, I think it's great, guys. I mean, I think this whole issue, and especially, I like.
Now we have.
Go ahead, Ralph.
We have to generate an indicator for how often you're going to drop out.
Yeah.
Absolutely, right? Or at least how often Superman is going to mention his superpowers, right? Well, so Ralph, let's talk about time. So how often should your suite, your grouping of indicators be, maybe reviewed, renewed, or whatever? You got at the whole issue of the complexities of the EPA and a regulator and oversight and a change of administrations. But even if perhaps we, shove that off the table and just talk about looking at one's performance, what are your views on how?
Well, I don't think you can shove those off the table. You are measuring indicators for a reason, and that reason is to prove success of your program to either the people you're reporting to, the provost or the director of physical plant, or to EPA, or to the people you're working with, right? The lab people in the laboratory. They want to know if it's worth their time to actually fill out a complete hazardous waste tag. And so you have to develop a environment where performance is measurable and people understand what those measurements mean. So my experience is that performance of indicators evolve with time, because the model that you're basing that indicator is modeling. So right now, my life is being driven right now by COVID indicators, CO2 levels in classrooms, how many people are sick on campus, how many people are in quarantine on campus. There are just mega number of indicators. And the reason there's so many indicators is the model is changing, right? In 2020, first half of 2020, we were all about super spreader events. Now we're about endemic infection. The physical model of COVID is changing very significantly. We're still working on the 2020 CO2 model, which is almost totally irrelevant now, at least in Keene. At Keene State, everybody's wearing masks indoors. Once you start wearing masks, CO2 becomes irrelevant. But, so you have to have some understanding of the physical model you're trying to work with, but you also have to figure out what the numbers are, how the numbers relate to that model. Is that?
Yeah, that makes
Avoid
sense,
the
Ralph.
question or help the question?
Do you polls for this webinar that we're going to try out? And so one is this, the poll on whether people use CO2, et cetera. Shall we launch that poll right now, Ralph, since you mentioned
Yeah,
it?
I'd be curious to see what people's responses to that.
Okay, so Chris will, there it is. He is very on top of things. So attendees, please do your voting. These three quick questions here. We're trying to incorporate more engagement, and both Ralph and Dawn came up with some wonderful poll questions for you. And I see that people, Patrick and Chris, are both using the Q&A. And so, you know, we may incorporate the questions as we go, or we may, as always, or as usual, wait till about 20 of the hour. So, but that's good. Thank you. And everyone, please do feel free to use the Q&A. It should be enough time for the poll. Can you show what the results are, Chris?
Sure, I can show the poll. I know we had a couple questions on here. We were just talking about the first one, but let me end the poll and hopefully I can re-show the other
would be
questions
great.
in a second. Yeah, so
Yeah,
here's the
thanks.
results.
All right, thanks, Chris. So a split between leading and lagging, a few both, and a bunch said neither. And do any of the situations exist? And there's a across the board, it seems like, with the exception of the environment promotes a culture of something else other than 100% safety. And where would you place your lab on? And it looks like many more on the reactive. And then Ralph, and perhaps even more familiar with the Bradley curve, having worked for them or working for them. But Ralph, did you want to start with any comments on the results, or just curious?
Well, I would just say yesterday, I think, or maybe the day before, the EPA sponsored a national webinar on this question about CO2 and COVID risk. And the speaker was pretty clear that his sense was neither, that, you know, CO2 is vaguely interesting in terms of COVID risk, but there's just so much subtlety in terms of interpreting numbers that he was not recommending CO2 measurements as a measure of COVID risk. In 2020, when we had super spreader events happening all over the world, I use CO2 numbers as an indicator for our administration that this classroom was too crowded. So there are ways I can imagine using CO2 as a COVID risk indicator in some specific situations, but I think that situation is past.
Comments at all on the Bradley curve in particular, or whatever?
Yeah, I'd like to just weigh in on that one. That, you know, in the DuPont world, we have this this Bradley curve that is a measure of cultural maturity, and it's focused on the maturity of the culture and its ability to and recognize, anticipate, recognize, and control risk. And in that reactive phase, in that reactive quadrant, what you're saying is, we do things for safety and risk control and risk management because we have to, right? So it's a regulatory driven, compliance driven approach. And as you move further to the right, you're taking care of risk because you have this deep-seated inherent care for yourself and other people. And so you're constantly looking out for yourself and for other people and doing what you know you could do to reduce or mitigate that risk. And so when we take what we do in industry and we apply it to laboratory settings, we do quite a bit of work in some research labs and that type of thing. We know that fatal accidents can happen in laboratories. We know that life-altering accidents can happen in laboratories. And so when we try to measure the cultural attributes that are present in that laboratory setting, it gives you some predictive value about how well that organization or that lab or that culture can anticipate the presence of risk and control it before something adverse happens. And so the further right you are on the Bradley curve into the independent and interdependent quadrants, tend to have better performance in that risk control area. And
Thanks.
so that's where we like to spend some of our time to develop our knowledge base about the leading metrics in that area.
Thanks. That was very helpful, I'm sure. It's, always curious how many are familiar with things that we talk about or not. So thank you very much. So let's talk about leadership a bit, and then let's talk about organizational culture. So Dawn, you and Ralph have talked about behaviors. And so I think we all know that leadership plays such a keen role in everything. Are there any examples that you can think of regarding leadership behavior change or maybe culture change that resulted from this focus on significant injuries and fatalities as leading indicators?
Yeah, I'll give one example that I'm really familiar with. That we had a site executive. And so in the laboratory world, you could think about it as, maybe a lab director, or maybe even at a university, a provost that had a deep passion for safety. And the way he wanted to show it was every time somebody experienced a recordable injury, he would have a meeting with that person and their supervisor and the safety director and the union representative of that person. And he wanted to have this very open conversation about what he could be doing better as the senior site leader to protect people. And that was the whole intention of this meeting. But how that meeting turned out when that person went back to their work environment, they basically described it as, I got my butt chewed out.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's not what really happened. It was just really this open dialogue about what could I do better. Now, when I asked that executive, so why are you focusing on people who had OSHA recordable injuries? He said, because that's what we get measured on. That's the metric that means something to the company. And so I'm trying to control that. And I asked him, what if you changed your focus to talk to people who experienced an event that had what we call SIF potential, potential for life-altering consequences? Didn't actually have life-altering consequences, but it could have. I said, for example, I was out in your plant and I saw and interviewed a group of people that were talking about a worker that almost fell off the top of a rail car. That he was on top of a rail car making an adjustment near the dome lid, and his rail car got hit by another one and he almost fell off, but he grabbed himself on the railing and then pulled himself back up. What would have happened if that guy had not grabbed that railing and fallen to the ground? He said, my gosh, he would have broken his hip. He could have been paralyzed. He could have broken his neck. He could have had a concussion. There's a lot of things that could have happened, but none of those things happened. So what would happen if you as a leader had a conversation with that crew about that event and what you could be doing as an executive site leader to prevent that event from happening? And he said, oh my gosh, that would change everything. And so I said, so what are you going to do? And his answer was, well, the next time an event like that happens, what I'm going to do is I'll call those people into my office and and I say, oh, time out. So what might be better than calling them into your office? And he said, how about if I put my coveralls on and my boots and my hard hat and I go out to the place where that happened and had a conversation with them out there. And I said, now you're on to something. So
Yeah.
what he did was he changed his own behavior around one thing, and that was the type of events he was interested in, changed his behavior around that, went out to the site, talked to the people about what he could be doing to protect them better, got some super meaningful information. His stock and his credibility with that workforce went way up because their reaction now was, my boss cares about something that I'm concerned about. That guy who got called into the office, he actually, who had the OSHA recordable, what he had was, he had a back injury where he was in his control room and he dropped a pen and he bent over to pick the pen up and he ended up popping a muscle in his back that turned into a recordable injury. So when he's in there talking to the site executive about that, all he's thinking is, I'm wasting this man's time. He's got more important things to do to talk to me about how I pick a pen up off the floor. So now this executive has turned his attention to events that have potential for life-altering consequences. And now everything in the culture of that organization changes because now other leaders are interested in the same thing. And so they're diverting their attention to something that's further upstream, that if they can control that, then they can prevent these outcomes that they get measured on. So I'll stop there, take a breath, and
no, that's fine.
See if that helped.
Well, Ralph has been busy answering questions posted. Thus, look, and there's 4 that Ralph has given a response to, which is really nice. And so obviously feel free to do likewise, Don. And Heather contributed in the chat. I did the same thing to my back by pulling the cable to my monitor so I could move it 2 inches. Yeah, backs are such tricky things. And once we bend over and put stressors on it. But Ralph, I didn't know if you wanted to also, we look to leadership everywhere. So academia, has its own leaderships, right? Institution-wide. And if you wanted to add to that conversation about their behaviors.
Well, that sort of speaks to adopting the right model. So the experience I had in that regards, I just posted 3 papers that we wrote as the 3 schools, the EHSF, the 3 schools wrote as a peer-reviewed paper. And the reason we did that is as we were at UVM, we had a committee that was overseeing the Excel project involvement of the institution. It was a faculty committee. And after I explained what we were doing to one of the faculty groups, they said, boy, somebody who I did not have a great working relationship with, how it is with the EHS people, sometimes you're regarded as an enemy, whether you deserve to be or not. And I had one of those situations with this person, and she was in the meeting, and she came up to me afterwards and said, this is really cool. You could write a paper about it. You could write an academic paper about this. And I said, yeah, that's not a bad idea. And when she told me that, it made me realize that that's how you build credibility in academia. You publish peer-reviewed journal articles. And once we started doing that, we published 3 of them on the Excel project. When I went to Cornell and worked on laboratory ventilation, we published articles there for what we did. Number 1, it made us get our act together to write out what we were doing. And number 2, it built credibility that we were not the only, it was not just some crazy EHS idea at UVM or Cornell that was doing this. We were demonstrating to our community, our stakeholders on campus, that what we were doing had interest off campus. And that's really what your culture is built around in academia. So it's, I don't know if that's an indicator, but it's a strategy to make your indicators meaningful to the stakeholders you have.
Yeah, when I was at UC Davis, one of the things the dean asked me to do was prepare for her, a quick 1 minute or 2 minute on something safety or risk related for every single meeting, talk, whatever that she was doing. She was very, very focused on trying to raise the level of safety culture, and that was certainly one way. The other quick thing I'll mention is, speaking of academic papers, I would have to dig it up, but a colleague of mine, Mark Rushka, had some good success with this. So I think we all know management by walking around. So there's safety management by walking around as well. And the organization he was in at the time saw really great advancements in that area. And I think to Don's point, you know, that leaders stock, right, with the people that they're representing instantly goes up because they're present and they're demonstrating that they care. So let's talk about the organization too, because I think this really gets at it. And so for both of you guys, and maybe Don, you can start. What about organizational culture? And so, and if you've already said something and I've missed it, I apologize, guys. But do you see a way to really measure the organization's characteristics related to this safety, culture, predictors, you know, more perhaps your area, Don, compliance, Ralph, more your area, or any other outcomes, of course, guys?
Oh, sure. Yeah, there's definitely ways to measure it. And, you know, we administer a survey that has, you know, 20 or 25 questions on it. But what we're asking about is, you know, at the frontline worker level, so at the lab tech level, you know, what's happening around safety in the sense that do you feel, and it's a perception survey, so do you feel safe working here? You know, do you feel like your management is responsive to your concerns around safety and risk? You know, at the frontline supervisor level, you know, how well do you respond to concerns when they're expressed to you? Do you follow up? Do you know, do what you're supposed to do as a supervisor? Do you encourage people to report near misses, to exercise stop work authority? What do you do as a immediate supervisor? And then at the management, you know, the corporate type level, you know, what are you doing to provide the resources and the funding to make the workplaces safer? And so there's a series of questions like that you can ask that all get to the cultural dynamics that exist in a workplace, and it influences how people think. It influences the direction that they make their decisions in, and it influences the behaviors that they perform when they're doing their job. So yes, it is definitely possible to measure that.
Great. Ralph, do you want to chime in on that as well from what you've seen? You've been at a few institutions and perhaps some good diverse experiences.
Yeah, it's hard to organize them into a story. That's your specialty, right? Yeah, I think we can move on to the next one. I think Don.
Okay, no worries. No, I think it's all good. So we're gonna change gears in a few minutes. Maybe after the next question or two, we'll launch our poll on topics, and we'll make sure we address all of the questions in the Q&A. But let's see if we can't get to a couple more. And so, what about cost versus benefit, and any way to really estimate that? It's always a struggle, I think, to really present ROI and what the true costs are and the true benefits are. And so I'd be very interested in hearing about that. And maybe it's along the lines of the value added for going in search of the indicators or the data to support the indicators. Maybe that is part of what adds the value. So, and Ralph, since I didn't go to you yet first, why don't I go to you?
I was amazed when I remember back in the 1980s when I started in EHS, amazed to realize that all the core information EPA was asking us for was not the stuff that the institution collected. They wanted to know how many chemicals were on the shelf. They wanted to know which ones were hazardous. They wanted to know who might be exposed to those. We didn't know what chemicals were on the shelves. We didn't know. Nobody kept track of who was working in the laboratories, what they were doing with the chemicals. And if you're not utilizing the information streams the institution collects in higher ed, all they really collect is money. They know who they're paying salaries to. They don't know why they're paying salaries to them. They know who they're sending checks to for vendors, but they don't know why they're sending them checks. It was very frustrating, and still sort of frustrating. You might hear my voice that the data that we are interested in EHS is not the data that makes the institution run, and it makes sense at some level because we're dealing with rare events. We are not dealing with the day-to-day activities of most people on campus, and so it is very expensive to generate a data stream. It's almost always on EHS's hands to, number one, convince people to start generating that data. Lots of conversations with purchasing, lots of conversations with HR to try to generate some of the data that we eventually got. And then number two, to maintain that data over time. It was amazing, even in the Excel experience, where every year for 8 years, we produced the same report and the same data. We would, in 2004, we sat down and write that report. We looked at the 2003 report and we couldn't figure out where those numbers came from. Even though we were the ones who wrote the report ourselves. It was, the system was just not built to generate the numbers that we need to use. So you have to think very strategically about how those numbers are going to be collected and interpreted as time goes by.
Very, very interesting. Thanks. And Dawn, what about from your perspective on this cost benefit, et cetera?
Yeah, I have to say that honestly, in the last decade, I have really tried to avoid having that conversation with my client executives. And the reason I do is because I have met so many amazing managers and leaders that understand that they have this ethical, moral imperative to protect their people, to protect the environment, to protect the community, that they don't need a cost benefit justification to spend the money and the capital that they need to make it safer and more environmentally protective. And that's sort of a real blessing to be able to work in an organization where the managers and the executives think that way, but they don't all think that way.
Right.
And so, yeah, every once in a while, you do have to provide a solid business case based on evidence and data that shows the true, financial impact benefit for investing in this control. And that's really a hard thing to do because sometimes it can make the difference between whether a project that is important gets funded or not. And the dilemma that we face there, and I know I faced this in the earlier parts of my career, is that I could be the smartest person in the world in regards to all the EHS data that I had at my fingertips. But I did not have the ability to communicate it in a way to my executives that would motivate them to do something different. I just didn't have that ability. And what I learned was that I was spending all of my time trying to get 100 business leaders to speak my language in EHS. And then I figured out I got to turn it the other way around. I got to learn their language.
Right.
I have to learn the language of the business. And then I have to translate what I'm trying to get done into their language. And then they understood it. And then they would start taking ownership and take investment responsibilities.
Yeah.
But you also had to show that an investment in an EHS program has collateral benefits to productivity, quality, customer satisfaction, that type of thing.
Right.
But you don't get there if as an EHS professional, all you do is talk to business people in your own language. You
Right.
really have to make that effort to learn their side of the business.
Yeah, and there's a lot of great attention to that. Patrick chimed in saying, "Don, you nailed it. You need to speak the language of business," and I that. I think this brings up. Oh, it just disappeared off my screen. But some of the questions that have been asked, and it looks like both guys have been answering them. But first, so as part of our transition, we're going to, Chris will launch the poll. This is the poll we always do on topics. So everyone who is attending, hosts and panelists, we don't get to vote, shucks, but we value this. I spend a lot of effort, and Chris does as well. We look at this, and so vote on as many of the topics that you would really like to see us offer in the future. We look at these over a series of webinars. Please, interested in being a panelist, always looking for or if you know someone, and always, folks, please feel free to reach out to me on your own, jonathan.klain@bioraft.com. Always, you can reach me. So great, thank you very much for that. I look forward to looking at that data. Well, let's look at some of these questions. And so, and Ralph, you chimed in on Carmen's thoughts on people-based safety instead of behavior-based safety. And we can choose to define each of those as we see. Ralph put some thoughts down, and Don, I didn't know if you'd like to chime in on that one, because I think the conversation is really getting to this. How do we look at people as people, and care that we have for them, and that it's part of our ethical and moral imperative, etc.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what the true difference is between people-based and behavior-based, because I look at people perform behaviors, so it's sort of in my world sort of the same thing. But what I do think is important, what's important about it is you have to look at the context of the situation that the person is in, and you have to take the time to understand why they would behave the way they do in that particular situation. So a person's behavior, we like to think it's always under their control, but it's not. That there are influences to that behavior that come from a lot of different directions, and it may push. That's what culture does, right? Culture can influence how a person behaves in a particular situation. So as a safety EHS professional, it's important for me to take the time to understand the entire context of that situation that that person is in before I make a judgment about their behavior.
Yeah, and I agree. I want to give you guys as much airtime as possible instead of chiming in on everything. Ralph?
What was the question?
Well, it was really Carmen's question about, looking
people
at
versus behavior safety
versus people. Yeah.
So I think this is something that the safety profession as a whole is struggling with a lot right now, is understanding the relationship between behavior and culture and individual motivation. Those are three different things, right? And how individual motivation plus culture equals some behavioral choice. And if you listen to podcasts, there's a couple of significant podcasts that address this on a routine basis. There's one from Australia called The Safety of Work, where they look at the academic literature and try to interpret it into practical information. I like that one a fair amount. There's another one, it'd be good if I remember the name of it, but I don't off the top of my head. So there's a couple of, and it's sort of this struggle between safety 1 and safety 2. Safety 1 being the traditional approach of identifying bad behavior and chasing it down and making it stop. And safety 2 saying, well, people are not doing this in order to create these behaviors in order to create danger. They're doing it to get the job done. How can we change the job to avoid those behaviors? And I think that's a real cultural challenge, both for the safety professional, but within the safety profession. OSHA is not going to be real interested in your safety 2 program, right? They're not going to, if you go too far upstream, they're going to, and they do an investigation of a fatality on your campus. All 3 campuses I've been on have had fatality investigations while I was there. It's not a fun situation, and indicators go out right out the window at that point. So I think that's a struggle that we face in an ongoing way in the EHS world.
Yeah, good point. If I could take a minute just to circle back to one of our poll questions, where we asked you to identify if any of the following situations existed in your lab. And one of them was a person could be working alone. A second one was core life-saving rules are not known or not always followed. Third one was recommended corrective and preventive actions have not been fully implemented. And then the last one that you responded to was recognized hazards have gone unabated for long periods of time. So here's my question is, why did I ask you about the presence of those 4 characteristics? The reason I did that is in preparation for this webinar, I went and looked at 7 SIF incidents that occurred in laboratories that involve fatalities or significantly life-altering injuries. And y'all are probably all familiar with these. T2 lab in Jacksonville, UCLA, Texas Tech, Yale, University of Hawaii, University of Utah, and most recently, Nanjing University. When I looked at those 7 events and I read their investigation reports, that's what you saw present in the time leading up to that event. Person was working alone in a lab. There were conditions that had been reported but had remained unabated. There were life-saving critical controls that were supposed to be following that weren't being followed. So my wrap up on that is, if any one of those exists in your lab, you got a yellow caution flag waving at you. If you have more than one of those existing in your lab, you might have a red flag that says you're setting yourself up for one of these potentially life-altering events. So that's what I spend my life doing, is investigating those types of accidents, extracting these precursors out of them, and looking for these patterns and trends that might exist in other laboratories. So I just wanted to make sure that I called your attention to those responses.
Yeah, thank you, Don. And what we can do is we'll post these on the webinar page so people can come back and look at them. I don't feel like we gave people enough time to answer them when we were running the first poll. Ralph, is there anything you want to add to that, or?
I think it's really interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way, but those are 4 key indicators. I just know that the challenge of naming a person could be working alone. I remember a East Coast research institution where EHS staff got curious about how much that actually happens. So they actually came in on a Saturday night, and they were astounded by how many people were in laboratories on a Saturday night by themselves. They sort of assumed that there was some, and there was a lot. And these are, I agree, there are yellow flags, but collecting the information to demonstrate how yellow those flags are, whether they're really red flags, that's a major lift.
That's a great point. You know what we call that? We call that on the ground field validation. And if you go out there and look for it with your own eyes, you've got real hard data to work with. Great story, Ralph.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. Let's go. Do we have a couple questions that still haven't been answered? Yeah, let's see. I know there's 2 open. No, it looks like they're done. So we got a few minutes here, and I just wanted to maybe give you guys a few more minutes to talk about anything that was important to you that we didn't get to. I know there was a long list of items to discuss today. So Don, is there anything else you want to share with us in the remaining minutes that we have today?
Well, I'll go back to my current life in COVID land. We're beginning, just EHS in general in the world is just beginning to understand what are the indicators of COVID risk that we are going to be expected to manage over the next, well, the rest of my career. I'm 65, so I will be working in my best of all worlds. I'll be working for 5 or 6 more years. I expect COVID to be an ongoing issue throughout. There's no way we're going to refresh our buildings to COVID management standards in the next 5 or 6 years. So how are we going to identify the leading indicators that demonstrate to all the stakeholders? In Keene State, we're talking upper administration, who happens to be a safety professional. So my president is a safety professional. I don't have to talk to her about indicators. She understands it, but she's not the primary audience, right? The students are the primary audience, the faculty, the parents. There's just a lot of people that have to be confident that they can come to work for the next 5 or 6 years without risking a fatal infection. And how do we think about that? How do we explain which indicators we're going to choose to make that case, and explain that we're not reducing risk to zero, but we are improving the situation as much as we can? And we do have at Keene State, we do have a special limitation in that we're not allowed to require people to be vaccinated, because the state of New Hampshire thought that was too much to ask of its employees. So we're doing this in a potentially unvaccinated scenario.
Wow. Don, and over to you. Anything you want to end us with, and I'll let you take us home.
Just a quick couple of things. In the now, Ralph and I both prepared a slide deck just to talk about just to codify some of the points we talked about today. In my deck, you'll see a reference to 2 resource documents on leading and lagging indicators. I would just invite you to go look those up if you want to have 2 like highly reliable documents for that subject. One is by the Campbell Institute from the National Safety Council, and the other one is from the CCPS, the Center for Chemical Process Safety, which is part of the American Chemical Society. 2 great references. And then I also have one slide in there that shows a portfolio of SIF metrics that a lot of the companies that we've worked with have developed and are using. And you might look at those as potential references for any leading metrics that you might be developing.
Yes, that's great. Thanks for the reminder. We will be posting those as well, so that everyone has access to them once this webinar is completed. So Don, any other closing words for us as we wrap up?
This was just a really interesting day, and I really appreciate being invited to participate. It was fun getting to read your questions and your comments, and again, I really appreciate it, and thank you for the invitation.
Oh yeah, certainly. We appreciate you as well. Ralph, anything from your end? Anything else you want to share with the team, the group?
Oh yeah, I have a self-serving announcement that we in August of 2022, we will be organizing a symposium at the ACS National Meeting on this topic of cultural indicators of success, and how can you demonstrate that your safety culture is improving. And if anybody's interested in contributing to the knowledge base, that would be really great. Sort of inspired by today's conversation, I realized that this was something that I would love to hear from people around the country as to what they found success at. And if there will be both virtual and in-person presentation opportunities. If you're interested in participating, please let me know. I'd be glad to help you get involved in that.
Great. And if anyone needs Ralph's information, they can reach out to Jonathan at jonathan.klain@bioref.com, or go to the page that you found this this posting on for this webinar, and Ralph's information is there. So gentlemen, thank you very much. And thanks to our audience today. It was really informative, and we look forward to seeing you again in a couple of weeks. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.